covering the story of the Underground Railroad for the past 14 years. Their studies have resulted in the forming of an organization, Underground History Project, a website, newsletter, and the discovery and restoration of a previously unknown Underground Railroad site. They received the 2008 Underground Railroad Free Press Prize for Preservation, Scholar in Residence status at Sage College in 2009, and numerous other recognitions. Paul and Mary Liz will relate the story of Stephen and Harriet Myers, a central story in the Capital Region's Underground Railroad history. And I now turn the podium over to Paul and Mary Liz Stewart.
For us, this journey actually started back in the late 1990s. For me, it was because I was a fifth grade teacher at the time, and I was working with fifth grade students who were trying to understand this Underground Railroad business, but being the kind of tangible thinkers that they were at the time, were really stuck on above ground trains and subways. So I thought, well, why don't we see what we can do to find some history in the neighborhood where the school is based, which is in Hilltowns, by the way, and see if we can't find some, some connections in the students' backyard, so to speak. And so we did start some research that did uncover a little bit of history related to this period in U.S. history. And I was hoping, after the school year ended, of course, the students moved on, but my own interest remained. I was hoping to keep the research going in the district where I was teaching at the time. However, there were various reasons why it made more sense to refocus my attention to home base, which for us was the city of Albany.
And over the years, I've always had an interest in history and also had an interest in journalism. And so I was doing some writing for the South End Scene newspaper. Anybody remember the South End Scene? Yeah. And I was doing some articles on Albany's history, African American history. And I'd done a series of them. I'd done a couple on the Underground Railroad, touching on subjects with it, but never really got into it as deeply as we subsequently did. So we decided that we were going to team up our efforts and see what we could discover, and it led to where we are today.
Something before we launch off into sharing some of the history that we've uncovered, I feel a need to apologize because our focus will not be just on Stephen and Harriet Myers. They will be brought in, but we have found over the years that we've conducted the research that we share with you today, and that in fact there are essentially 8 principles that have shown themselves to emerge from the historic documents. A promise that we made to ourselves when we started was very much to let to do our best to honor the integrity of the historic documents. And what we were finding, as we conducted our own research initially for personal purposes, we were finding a very different story emerging from the documents related to this Underground Railroad history. And so it is embedded in the principles that we will share.
Yeah, and I think as we go forward, we'll kind of highlight some of those things that you've probably heard quite commonly about the Underground Railroad. And we'll be displaying information, documents, telling stories about things that kind of run a little bit of the grain, a little bit different from some of those things.
Just one more thing I'd like to ask quickly. Who in there is from Albany? How about, who's from Albany? Who's from, currently living, perhaps.
Albany City.
Yeah.
City.
Albany City.
Albany
City. How about Troy?
Albany County.
Anybody from Troy? Anybody in Albany County?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Confusion.
All right. How about people outside of Albany County? I heard there were some folks who are part of the Humanist Society here from Saratoga and Massachusetts and so on. So as we go through, if there are questions or thoughts, should we save them to the end?
Well, maybe we save them to the end,
if you don't mind,
but we can kind of tie in some
address,
other
geographic references, of course, that may relate to other places besides the capital region.
So, what are these 8 principles? We used to call them 7, but we've added an eighth one, and that's relevance for today. Document-based, myth versus history, secret versus public, movement, not safe houses, the role of African Americans in leadership positions in the Underground Railroad, civil disobedience, language, and public memory is important and relevance for today. And so we're going to go through each of these and talk about some of the aspects of them. One of the things that people you've probably heard a lot over the years in terms of the Underground Railroad is that it was all secret and therefore you can't know anything about it. And that's a fascinating thing. But as we began our journey into trying to explore the material, read things, first we spent a lot of time asking people things, and they told us a bunch of different things. And then we started reading things, and we found that things that we read tended to contradict what people told us. So that's one of the reasons we sort of, that and maybe a few other reasons why we sort of moved toward this idea of using the documents, letting the documents speak to us about what the story of the Underground Railroad was. And one of the first things we're going to come back to this in a minute, but here's a document, it's a sample, it's a clipping from a newspaper, and this was not uncommon, particularly by the time you got to the late 1850s. Reports in newspapers of various kinds, either reports of certainly ads for fugitives who had escaped from enslavement, certainly references in terms of court cases and what had happened with specific cases that might have been celebrated, or even something like this, which was probably almost done in the nature of a press release. The local Underground Railroad group in Troy, in this case, placed something in the paper, and I'll read some of this to you. It says, public meeting. At a public meeting at the Liberty Church on September 13th or 15th last, by the Vigilance Committee of the Underground Railroad, Reverend Jonathan C. Gibbs was called to the chair, and the following business was transacted. And they went on to tell you about a couple of resolutions, and then it says, the following persons were appointed to act for the ensuing year as the Vigilance Committee, as the group that does the Underground Railroad in Troy. And they mentioned Philip Owens, Charles Hardman, William Henry, Captain Hawkins, William Bishop, Southey Bingham, R. Schoonmaker. It says the meeting, let's say, listened to an address from a Reverend Mr. Crawford of Nantucket, and then adjourned subject to call of the acting committee. So this is a secret organization, remember. and that's the kind of thing that we encountered a great deal in exploring documentation that was part of the Underground Railroad story.
This is another piece of documentation that has been very informative both for us, but also is an example of the kinds of documents that are available for us to better understand this period in history. And this particular document is actually a letter written by Harriet Myers to William John Jay, the Jay family from Katona. And of course, in Harriet's own writing, that in and of itself was so exciting when we came across this letter. But in addition, Harriet very nicely tells us a considerable amount about the role of women in this movement. And that's been something that's been very, very difficult to uncover in terms of details of who did what, when they did it. Men seem to be a little bit more public about what they did. They wrote about themselves more often. Their letters and narratives certainly have been better preserved than that of women. So we do treasure this particular letter. But in it, just to paraphrase, Harriet tells us that, in fact, she thanks the Jay family for having provided both financial assistance over the years to the efforts of the Myers and their associates in the Vigilance Committee here in the city of Albany. She also expresses thanks to the Jay family for sending the freedom seekers, who in this case she uses the word fugitives, but sending the fugitives to the Myers to receive the assistance that they were seeking. She also goes on to say, well, Mr. Myers was often like George, working as a butler at a hotel there because there was a family of 4 children to support, and so she's on the home front line. She's on the front lines, welcoming these freedom seekers who have been directed to look for Stephen Myers in Albany. She's on the front lines, welcoming these freedom seekers into the home, interviewing them to determine what needs they might have, then going out into the community in order to solicit what was needed to meet the needs of these people who had been sent to look for assistance. As well, she very succinctly tells us that it was very difficult to find what was needed to meet the needs of these freedom seekers because of the prejudice against our people. Here we are, a letter in, 1860, in the city of Albany, and so often we have this notion of, oh, the North, free, safe, at least the traditional canon is marshaled out about this history, and yet very clearly the pro-slavery sentiments were strong enough that while there was an opportunity for strong advocacy and abolition efforts to be present here in the capital region, the city of Albany and the capital region, we still understand from Harriet's letter that it was not, an easy situation to deal with, and there was a considerable amount of opposition. So again, documentation, rich with information that helps to inform certainly and fill out what over time has become what we tend to call a very small soundbite about a rather significant period in our state and nation's history, and in the international story as well.
We won't spend a lot of time talking about this right now, but this is a newspaper called the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate. It was published out of Albany in the 1840s by a group called the Northern Star Association, which is a group that sort of preceded the Vigilance Committee that Myers was involved with in the 1850s. There was also a Vigilance Committee at that time. There's a whole complex of history there. But this newspaper was a paper that Stephen Myers was involved in producing, along with a number of other people here in Albany. And it was really had reach all over the Northeast. And so it was, and oftentimes in the newspaper, they would recount information about things they were doing in terms of the Underground Railroad. So again, another source for the public side. That is March 16th, 1842. Yeah, and that's a good point that you bring up. When we talk about the Underground Railroad, we think of it in terms of a story that really extends back to the beginnings of the country, not just the 1850s, as is often presented. There are stories of escape that go back to the beginning. There's an incident where George Washington writes and complains to a friend that some organized group in Philadelphia is assisting people that he has enslaved to escape from his plantation. So it really is something that stretches back to the beginnings of the country. And of course, there are lots of first-person narratives that tell individual stories, like this one, The 12 Years a Slave, by Solomon Northup, a man from the Glens Falls area who was kidnapped into enslavement and then eventually was able to escape, and Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs.
Is anyone familiar with either of these narratives?
Yeah.
Okay. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Solomon Northup? Okay. Yeah, both very rich, again, very rich accountings from the voices of people who lived through this period. And that's something that's been very important to us as we've continued our research, is to continually look to the voices of people of this period, to hear what they have to say, what they have to tell us, how they can inform us. And narratives such as this are certainly very rich for that kind of information, dispelling some of the romantic notions that have attached themselves to this history, but as well, it's because of the interest in Underground Railroad history that has grown over the last 10, 15 years. A number of the narratives are also becoming available to us digitally, so it does make the voices of people of this period more accessible to all of us.
Yeah, and also it speaks to the complexity of the situations. These two books were written by or people who either wrote or collaborated with others to write their stories. Not totally separate from the literate end of things. Myth versus history. Needless to say, most people are familiar with Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and the tremendous role that they played. But they're certainly not the only figures of importance in this complex story. We have a host of people that we could go into their stories who were local people, their local ties. But I'm not sure what the next slide is. Let's see. Okay. All right, go back. Again, when you think about those major people, recognize that focusing simply on their story kind of creates a sort of mythology, if you will, without recognizing that there are countless groups of local people across the country that made it possible for them to do what they did.
And I think when we get a little bit further on and reference the principle about African American leadership in this movement, some of the individuals you see pictured here will be spoken about in a little bit of a little more detail. But that was one of the things that was particularly fascinating to us as we followed the trail of footnotes and bibliographic references and started uncovering the primary documents. The voices of African Americans were becoming much more dominant in this movement, and I think historically it's been somewhat sad that we've the traditional retelling is focused so much on Tubman and Douglass. I mean, certainly Tubman had a biographer, and Douglass was very concerned about keeping his papers, so both individuals have a rich treasure trove of resources for us to look back to and touch and make use of. However, many of the individuals you see pictured here, their concern was not preserving documents to retell their story, so it has become certainly much more of a challenge. But yet their voices are embedded in the documents, much of that reference to the Harriet Tubman letter or Stephen Myers through the Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate and other newspapers. Colored Men's Convention's resources have been very rich for bringing forward voices of some of these individuals here. So again, the documents are broad, they're wide, but the myths are hopefully being sort of revised. We're trying to grab hold of a deeper understanding of the real story. We like to bring this particular reference forward. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Something very familiar, I would assume, to everyone sitting here, and hopefully to every school child that passes through our educational system, and yet it is really this that informed the Underground Railroad. This is what it was about, which to us is in contrast, again, to that standard retelling of, these generous white folks helping those poor oppressed black folks out of slavery, aren't they great, and life went on, and everybody was happy. And the reality is, no, this is what it was about. It was about a movement demanding equality, demanding justice, demanding the human rights that were guaranteed to every person who lived in this country, but clearly through the maintenance and the promulgation of the institution of slavery prevented this reality for so many people.
One of the things when we think about documents and just in terms of the myths. Yeah. This is a map, a study map from the National Park Service, an early study map that presents a picture of the routes, as it were, of the Underground Railroad. Maps being static things as they are, they present something that's kind of fixed in time. And of course, the reality is that the whole thing was a very dynamic situation that was changing over time. And of course, this is a map that presents the United States in the 1850s. How can you tell? Well, it's because there are slave states on the bottom and supposedly free states on the top. And of course, the reality was that every state that was part of the United States from the colonial times, with the exception of Vermont and Maine, had slavery at one time or another. So, yeah, go ahead.
Does anyone know here when New York State abolished slavery?
1827.
And New York State, if I may take a brief excursion, New York State has the remarkable history of being second to the last of the northern free states to abolish that institution. Records indicate that when slavery was legally abolished in the state, as many as 10,000 people were set free. Of course, that does not account for any of those individuals who may have been sold off, so the investment wasn't lost. There's no accounting really for how many people were sold off before 1827 date rolled around. And then there's the whole story related, which I won't go into here, but the whole piece of the history related to the continuing legal support of enslavement in New York State, even though it was considered a free state after 1827.
Right. And of course the fugitive slave laws,
Right.
which we'll come to a little bit later. But what I want to point out about this map is that you see, usually when we think about the Underground Railroad, we think about people escaping from enslavement in the South and going north to Canada. But you see there's some other arrows on this map. People escaping from Texas to Mexico, people escaping into the Caribbean. And if we were really trying to be comprehensive here, we draw some more arrows on this map because there were many people who escaped into the Great Plains, many people who escaped overseas both to Europe and Africa, and there's even some fascinating stories about California and people in California. So there's a great deal more to the story than the myths in some ways that some of the map representations promote.
And just also the notion of routes as well, a very misleading concept. Our research has led us to understand that people chose whatever way was the safest, and that the notion of routes really doesn't do justice to the ingenuity and the self-advocacy of people who chose to escape conditions of enslavement and who chose through commitment to civil disobedience to support those who were seeking to escape enslavement.
So going through all these documents, of course, we came across this one, which is one of our favorites, which is a handbill, a fundraising handbill from the local Vigilance Committee in Albany in the mid-1850s that told about what the Vigilance Committee was doing. They were trying to raise money and resources. And in the course of doing this, again, the secrecy of the Underground Railroad, they presented their address. They told about a meeting that was held on the 27th of April, a couple of resolutions that were passed. And then they put names here: T. Elkins, Secretary; C. Brooks, Charles Brooks, Chairman. And then they went on to say, if you want to make a donation, this is who you make the donation to: Stephen Myers, William Topp, or any of the gentlemen of the committee. Then there's some other names there. And then the rest of the committee, the names of the committee are presented there, and a story about a group of freedom seekers who passed through the area and made their way into Canada by way of Buffalo. Great secrets. So, and of course, our curiosity was aroused, and we said, well, where is this 198 Lumber Street? And we went looking for it, and eventually we found this house. That's a long story. We won't belabor it here, but which, through a whole series of events, our forming of an organization called the Underground Railroad History Project, we were able to purchase the building and enter into working to restore it. And so it was a building that was on nobody's radar as far as that it was in fact an Underground Railroad site. And it very quickly got on the National Register and the State Register. And it's at 194 Livingston Avenue. So roughly in the same spot where they left it at 198. Yeah.
We also look at this building as not just an Underground Railroad site, but understanding the Underground Railroad as a movement, movement for civil rights and so on. We do look at this building and interpret it as a site of conscience, because we do have records that indicate that while in the mid-1850s, when Stephen and Harriet Myers and their 4 children were living in this building, that they were welcoming freedom seekers to this particular address, as well as others where they lived in the city, but this one being the one standing building on its original footprint that we've been able to document. So it really has become quite a treasure, and as Paul said, the restoration, though I'd like to mention, is intended to restore this site so it becomes a dynamic experiential site, a place to come and experience Underground Railroad history. So hopefully we will see you all there too.
Secret versus public. We've already talked about this a little bit. Again, this idea, here's a clipping from a newspaper called the Tocsin of Liberty. That was another abolitionist paper published out of Albany in the early 1840s. The word tocsin means bell or alarm, kind of like Liberty Bell. Tocsin of Liberty, right? So, and this is an announcement about the Eastern New York Anti-Slavery, the Eastern New York Liberty Association, which is one of the groups that was involved in working with Underground Railroad activity. And in this call for organization, there's a bunch of people who sign the call. And typically those are the activists who are involved in the Underground Railroad. And just some of the people, we just pulled out some of them here from
The full list references people though up and down the Hudson Valley, west out the Mohawk Valley, and then even into Massachusetts area. So it's quite a lengthy listing of people who were involved in both involved in the movement and activists in their own communities. The other thing that a call like this suggests to us is that people were beginning by this time, the early 1840s, beginning to recognize the value of more formal organizational efforts. In the history, as we've encountered it, in the history of this movement, there was never any one body directing activity. In fact, there tended to be a considerable amount of flying sparks. One group taking one focus and one set of strategies, another choosing another set of strategies. And while ultimately the goal was the same, the abolition of this institution of slavery in the country, the actual strategies for getting there tended to be somewhat variable. So there were a number of organizations at different levels that, again, were all working, to achieve the same goal, but in somewhat different fashions. I think this was the formation of the Eastern New York Anti-Slavery Society. That was this one. Yeah. And again, so while that's forming, you've got Albany Vigilance, the Vigilance Committee in Albany, the Vigilance Committee in Troy. There's national organizations, so it was quite much like movements today. People having the same goal, but yet coming at that goal through a variety of methods.
And of course, this flyer again, which I mentioned before, tells us a great deal, and so much about the Underground Railroad was about food, clothing, shelter, and transportation. And so it kind of reminds us of our food pantries somewhat today.
But if I can point out, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
Okay, the thing that I so like about this notion of vigilance story about, so an example of a story is the Abel Brown story, where Abel Brown, white Baptist minister, thank you, home base for a period of his life was in the city of Albany, but he was a preacher, so he traveled around quite a bit and took his preaching skills and applied them to the anti-slavery efforts. Well, he was very much about the business of agitation, as you often share, Paul. He would take great delight in hanging out at the docks, the city of Albany docks, and sort of harassing and haranguing people. And I suppose today we might call him, rather than an agitator, someone who's busy about the business of harassing people. He would follow people around. There are accounts of him following people around thinking that they were, believing that they were seeking either freedom seekers or abolitionists. And so Abel Brown would follow them around and harass them and do what he could to thwart their efforts to achieve their goal, which is to identify and locate people to be returned to enslavement. So, sort of being vigilant had this, sort of this.
A raw edge.
Yeah, raw edge to it. Yeah.
Yeah.